This is a Step Beyond the Fire podcast. My name is Cully. I'm a land manager and a wildlife biologist here in my home state of Florida. I invite you to join me on a journey as I seek to document the little-known stories told by those who use fire for the benefit of the land, also known as prescribed fire. So come on, let's head into the field and meet the people where the flame ends and new life begins. Welcome back to A Step Beyond the Fire. This is your host, Cully Lord, here today with Jason Houck. Jason is the Associate Principal and Ecological Services Manager at Inwood Consulting Engineers down in the Orlando area. He contributes his wide range of experiences to address important conservation needs such as environmental permitting, habitat restoration, mitigation planning, and landscape connectivity. A lot of good things there. So Jason, he also teaches several collegiate courses, and he has a really diverse background in the use of prescribed fire in Florida as well. Welcome, Jason.
Thanks, Cully. I'm really excited to be here. This is something I've been looking forward to for a while, ever since I met you.
You and I had a chance to connect recently at the Spring Wildlife Society meeting that took place up in Jacksonville, which was a lot of fun. And I heard some of your great talks about wildlife connectivity and the larger scale, the landscape scale efforts that's going on in Florida. So there was a lot there. And I am excited to talk a little bit about that today and get some of your expertise and experience for folks to hear about in that whole world.
Okay.
But before we get into that, I wanted to ask you whether you could tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into the whole conservation world.
Okay. Well, I mean, so I'm not from Florida, as you know. Seems like about half the people in Orlando that I meet are from somewhere else. I grew up in Chattanooga, Tennessee, which is sort of southeastern Tennessee. And my earliest memories, I think, what really kind of started just an interest in conservation and nature in general. I can remember being very small enough to sit on my grandfather's lap, and he had what felt like just a voluminous collection of National Geographic magazines. And we would sit for what felt like hours just flipping through magazines and looking at, and I always wanted to look at the pictures of animals. And I always, kind of imagined, being in, these amazing action shots, these National Geographic photographers. And for the longest time, like growing up, I used to think that's what I wanted to do. And then as I get older, one of the things that always kind of stuck with me was, I want to be outdoors. I want to be outside. So I did a lot of the normal stuff that, I think a kid growing up in the 80s did. I did Boy Scouts and Cub Scouts. We did family camping trips, with friends. But it was really in high school that I got into like backpacking in the Southern Appalachian Mountains, with friends in high school that, I still see, and we still go, camping today. Actually, the last trip we took was, we went and did kind of an old guy's trip at Cumberland Island National Seashore, which is one of my favorite places, in the world. And so I got to call it, well, I spent some time in the Marines, where you can camp professionally, so to speak. But what it told me is like, even in like some really trying conditions, I still really wanted to be outside, and even I think that was before like being interested in conservation. It was more just kind of like the, John Muir's outlook on stuff, which is, I just want to be in it. And that, that was, I kind of joked about like, that was my church. So by the time I get to college, I went to University of Tennessee in Knoxville, kind of bounced around a couple majors. I did all the stuff. My dad was an executive. And I kind of thought, well, all right, now I have to grow up and, get a real job and that sort of thing. And but still kept going outside. So finally, after a couple, failed majors, not really failed, but, doing other things and not loving it, I realized I need to find something that I can, that'll pay me to do what I love, or I need to find something that will pay me so that I can live and still do what I want to do. And so I had a professor that I took a conservation biology class, and he also taught GIS, and was really, I think it was a pivotal moment in my life. He was like, you can do this. He said, there's opportunities out there. And he ended up bringing me on as a graduate student. And I had an assistantship, and it was through a USGS paid program called the National Biological Information Infrastructure. And it was 20 hours a week of doing GIS. And then I worked on several other really cool projects. I worked on the American chestnut restoration project that was going on.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's another really interesting one.
Yeah, bringing in blight-resistant chestnut trees. And,
wow. Can you explain for folks who might not know what GIS is? And what it stands for?
So GIS is Geographic Information Systems. It's essentially, people call it mapping, but it's not Google Maps. It's a database that adds a where in the world component to it.
Not so easy to navigate either. People spend their whole careers on that, and it can be a struggle, that program. It's really effective.
It really is. And I tell my students all the time, I said, if you can finish, there's going to be 1 million bachelor's in biology degrees coming out every year. If you have GIS on your resume, you are a step ahead of all the ones that don't. Because every project that we work on, GIS touches that project in some way. Even if it's just we pull all the soils data and land cover data and all that, try to figure out where do we start looking for listed species, and on the wildlife crossing stuff, it is 100% integrated start to finish.
Yeah, so something that all kinds of natural resource professionals and everybody from across the spectrum uses this program.
Yeah.
In one way, shape, or form or another. And any map that you see out there, modern day version of our maps that's how they're made.
And everything's online. When I started, we were using the old hard copy USGS soil books, and now I've got a 24-year-old that works for me, and I pulled one of those out the other day, and she goes, "What is that?" I was like, "Well, this is a printed portion of the internet, that we used to use, back in the day." But GIS, at least in our world, is ubiquitous.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So. And what was your undergraduate degree in?
So undergrad was in biology with environmental science with a concentration in biology, and then graduate school was then ecology, really more with applied ecology. I did my graduate research on the effects of acid mine drainage on salamanders, plethodonid salamanders specifically, which is the family Plethodonidae are the lungless salamanders. So they're hypersensitive to changes in environment. They're a good indicator species. Yeah, I did all this stuff in the mountains and then moved to Florida.
Yeah, that's another thinking about indicator species. I use certain species that are associated with, for instance, longleaf pine ecosystems, but I don't focus on a scale like that. But from what I remember, reptiles and amphibians they're kind of the first sign of change in an ecosystem. Isn't that right?
Yeah. One of the things that, I got my thesis was a portion of a much larger study that was done across several universities. But, one of the things that I saw on my transects in Smokies, and I was in Joyce Kilmer and Cherokee National Forest and Great Smoky Mountains National Park, that whole area, I spent time at Highlands Biological Station, which is a field station associated with UNC Chapel Hill that's in Highlands, North Carolina, which is, that's salamander capital of the world. And, one of the things that you see with the plethodon salamanders specifically is the eggs, they look like little, like a little bit of jelly. They actually get desiccated in the water, which is something that most people don't really think about because the concentration of the water inside the egg is higher than it is, outside in the stream because there's pollutants and other things. And what happens is
Oh, wow.
because the egg membrane is permeable, it's just like your fingers. It can actually pull the water out of them, and so the embryos in it won't develop. And so you can find adult salamanders in those areas, but then you don't find the juveniles, and you definitely don't find the aquatic stage. So it was using them as an indicator of water quality, and then comparing that to abiotic factors that are considered in the Clean Water Act Section 305B report, which is a water quality report that all the states are required to produce. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I mean, long story short, pollution is bad, and that's that's what I was able to determine is that if the water quality is bad in a stream, it'll have an adverse effect on the local ecology. Not really groundbreaking research, but it was enough for me.
Well, it's a great reminder that we tend to, the everyday person out there tends to overlook those kinds of things on that scale. So it reaffirms a lot of things that we tend to forget about as.
Yeah, I think it's really easy to lose sight of it. Really all the science that's going on, especially that, that's happening at universities and then, at the agency level and even on the private sector, where I am.
Definitely. So, and then beyond the classroom, when you get into working in the field, were you always in the private sector or did you work in the public sector?
Yeah, I was. I finished. So the position that I had, I was a what they call an RA, which is, you have TAs and RAs. And so I didn't have to, I only taught one lab. The rest of the time I was working in the GIS lab, basically managing data, and, entering data into this massive, ArcInfo based database. So that grant funding was running out at the end of when I was graduating. And, I had a couple options. My dream job when I was an undergrad was to, get a PhD, college professor, do research my whole life. That to me was, tenure was the life for me. And I had just gotten married. As a graduate student, I had, tuition and fees and everything covered, but, I was making about $11,000 a year. Just gotten married.
Money.
Yeah, we had two big dogs, and these things like don't spend any money till Friday.
Well, back then, that was. I think nowadays, if you're a graduate student, from what I remember 10 years ago, anyway, if you're making about 18 or 20,000 a year, man, you're on the top of the heap.
Yeah, this was 2000, 2001.
Okay.
So yeah, I mean, there were some cup of noodles nights, that sort of thing, and so I'm sitting in my kitchen with my new wife at the time, and well, I mean, we're still married, and I was like, so I'm really putting a lot of thought into this PhD idea and all that. I really was interested in going to the Savannah River Ecology Lab, which is University of Georgia. There's a guy there by the name of Whit Gibbons, really kind of a salamander guru, and that was the direction I wanted to take. And she looked me dead in the face and said, "How about a JOB? How about you do that?" And that was a pivotal moment. And so I started looking for positions, and I had a job offer coming out of grad school with the Tennessee Valley Authority that was a GIS analyst position. It was definitely the safe route, but it was the thing that scared me is it was a desk job. It was rectifying aerial photography, some stereoscopes. I had done that, but I had that feeling that like this is not what I want to do. This is not outside. So I started applying for positions, and then there was a position that opened up or that became available at a consulting firm in Orlando. I didn't know anybody down here. But they had a contract with the Southwest Florida Water Management District, and it was updating floodplain models and floodplain maps. So it was still GIS, but it was in their environmental group. And I got that job, and I spent about the first year doing mostly GIS and training their staff how to do that. And at the same time, I was very fortunate to have a boss that said, he goes, the ecology in the sense that ecological concepts and all that, but you don't know vegetation here, you don't know the wildlife. And so the best thing he did for me is he goes, now what we're going to do is every time we go to the field, you're going with us and your job is to be a sponge. He goes, don't feel pressure. Like if you come back and one more plant than you knew yesterday, that's the goal. And that has stuck with me throughout my career. And I tell my students that now. I tell my interns.
It's a great philosophy.
I was like, it is taking a bite out of the elephant.
Sure.
But, you can go from scrub species down to wetlands out to the coast. And, it's bonkers how much diversity there is in Florida. And so I did that for several years. And then in 2008, Inwood, and I knew some people there, and I was always very impressed with the company. They decided that they wanted to start an ecological services group, and they said, do you want to do it? And it was one of these like leap of faith kind of things. They had no history, and they said, you can make it what you want. And so I did there, and this is my 15th year there.
The rest is history.
Yeah. And, now I'm the old guy, in the back telling them where to go in the field. Yeah.
And so I think this is a great time to talk about some of the interesting work that you're doing, because over the years, I've seen several of your presentations over the years, mostly within the Wildlife Society group, which is a great professional organization that you and I are both a part of, which is there's scientists, researchers, managers, and even people who aren't biologists who are part of this organization to learn about the latest goings on in wildlife, basically wildlife around the world.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of interesting projects that are going on. But what struck me is your current work it's involving wildlife crossings. And Florida is really a hot spot for this. I've seen a lot of photographs and read some articles about what they're doing out west and connecting those big landscapes. But Florida has such a pressing need for this, and there's a lot of interesting sort of projects that are happening in conjunction with the Department of Transportation and these big entities that are, as development continues, there is more and more of a need to connect our natural areas in this state. Could you tell us a little bit about some of the projects that you're currently involved with?
Okay. The first major project I got involved with Inwood was along State Road 40, which is starts on the east side of Ocala, really just west of Silver Spring State Park. And the first section I worked on went about 26 miles out to US 19, which is coming out of like Altoona and, just east of Juniper Wilderness. And so that started out as what they call a PD&E, or Project Development and Environment Study, which for the Florida Department of Transportation is the NEPA step. So NEPA is the National Environmental Policy Act, and it's a federal statute that essentially says anytime you have federal dollars applied to a project, you have to show that you don't have adverse environmental impacts. Now, environmental can mean a lot of things. For people in my world, it typically means the bugs and bunnies, but it can be contamination. It can be environmental justice, such as, it's why we don't, just assume we're going to put a landfill in an economically depressed area, things like that. So the environmental umbrella is fairly large, but that PD&E study had a lot of very involved stakeholders outside of just the Florida Park Service, the Marjorie Harris Carr Greenway, Ocala National Forest, but there was also a lot of very involved citizens and the Black Bear Scenic Byway Committee. And this is a citizens group, really a grassroots organization that's very involved in not only just the aesthetics of the corridor itself, but also they're very cognizant of the effect that the road has on wildlife. And so what came from the PD&E study was some preliminary evaluations to see what sort of wildlife crossings or what sort of habitat connectivity enhancements could we include on this project that would still accomplish the transportation mission, which is to get from A to B, but then minimize the effect on wildlife. At the time, the black bear was still listed in Florida. Now it's a managed species, but it's a really good, North and Central Florida umbrella species. So if we can accommodate black bear movement, we tend to catch a lot of other things.
So umbrella meaning?
Yeah. So umbrella species is something where, if we can provide a conservation benefit for that species, we're really going to benefit a lot of species as well, because they utilize similar habitats, they have similar patterns, and in the Ocala population specifically of black bears, the range is so large that if we can make sure that we can connect large enough habitats to support viable black bear populations, then we'll also get indigo snakes, and we'll also get gopher tortoises, and we'll also get turkeys and deer. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a listed species. We can get all the small, reptiles. We get all the, gopher frogs that are breeding in the ephemeral ponds, bobcats, all of those things. They're all important because they're all part of the ecology.
And this particular area that you're talking about, it seems like this podcast, it kind of has a tendency to come back to the Ocala National Forest. We've talked about the forest quite a bit on the past few episodes, but I can attest to the fact that having worked on the black bear management team in that area, that a lot of wildlife, especially bears, get hit on that section of the highway because it's on the south end of the national forest. There's these big these big landscapes there where bears are moving. A lot of transient males will go up and down through the corridor there. And
I don't know if you know or knew Walt McCown.
I know him. Yeah,
he's a bear guru
now, right?
Yeah, he was one of the first people that I had the opportunity to work with on the wildlife crossings out there, and I remember him saying that this is it's been a long time coming. And, he was an old timer by the time, I came around, but he was a wealth of knowledge. Mm-hmm. We also worked with some faculty from UCF, from the University of Central Florida. They had some students out there that did some mark recapture studies, that had done some hair snare studies. So we could see, really where a lot of the hot spots were. And then I started out very early on doing, really it was just heat maps using GIS to see, if we're going to spend the money on a crossing, which can be, in the millions to the tens of millions of dollars a piece. We want to make sure that we're, spending that tax money wisely, because if we do it poorly, that will get thrown back in our face.
Definitely. Yeah.
So we spent about 3 years looking at where wildlife were crossing the road. And by the time we completed the PD&E study, one of the things that was interesting is the Juniper Prairie section, or Juniper Wilderness section, if you know that, which is really just west of 19, where the Florida Trail crosses.
Yes.
We actually recommended not to widen the road in that area. And that recommendation was accepted. And we said, because that area, it's some old scrub, and there was a lot of bear movement in that area, and we couldn't pinpoint it. Whereas some of the areas really more west, especially near Silver River, there were some corridors that were pretty well defined, that bears were using, and we got recommendations in there. But they accepted not to widen that area. So there are some passing lanes in there, and there's one way station. But right now they are going with a no build in that area. And then when that was finished, they actually extended our study. So we went from 19 and we went all the way out to the existing 4-lane, which is in Ormond Beach. So it turned the whole project into a little over 40 miles going into Volusia County.
Wow. So you were able to figure out with this heat mapping thing you were talking about, you were using that as a tool to figure out, okay, so most of the bears, most of the wildlife are crossing at these little pinch points here and here and here.
Right.
And so how does the heat map concept work?
So what the heat map does is and this was really I can't put enough credit on the students that did this. This was roadkill studies. This was bear telemetry. This was the hair snares and mark recapture. What we were trying to do is figure out where wildlife were consistently crossing the corridor. And then what we did is every time you had that, we basically take a point. And in GIS, when we start adding and dropping all these points in, it doesn't take long before you start seeing patterns. And the heat map it's kind of a GIS term. I guess it's a GIS term. It's a mapping term that we use where we color code those points based on density. So the areas, and we had basically 1/10 of a mile sections of the road that we sectioned off, and you had to assign a wildlife occurrence to that segment. And then once we start piling all those on, we said the more points you had per 1/10 of a mile segment, the darker the color would be. And so it looks like a dark red were the areas where we had really high consistent crossings. So we said, well, when we're going to do that first cut of where do we need to put these crossing features, like let's make our first recommendation be here, and then let's see if the engineers can make it work. And sometimes they didn't. But it was one of the things where we could also justify, to the bean counters and and the folks that in Tallahassee and that are in charge of the money, that there's actually some thought behind this. And so that was really what we did with the heat maps, and that was really the first step.
Wow, that's incredible. So there's a way to sort of quantify where these higher priorities areas are, and then comes the task of, okay, you've done these great studies and you've gotten this information together. What does a wildlife crossing look like in this area? Is it an underpass?
So we have several, and the design was specific to what we found in the area. So the smallest crossings that we have in the corridor are elliptical pipes. They're 48 inches, and those are areas where we actually had tagged or had documented indigo snakes, gopher tortoises, small mammals, small herps. And it was also an area where I couldn't justify raising the road because of utilities or something like that. So it's one of these things where, all right, well, let's see what we can kind of shoehorn in here that's going to be better than nothing.
Give them some space to get across. And
exactly. Something is better than nothing was the attitude.
Yeah.
Then we moved up. We have some 8x8 box culverts. We have some 50-foot bridges. We have some 400-foot bridges where we had some areas where we have a known sand skink population that's adjacent to State Road 40. And we also have, on the other side of 40, we have 2 ephemeral wetlands that we did call surveys for gopher frog. And at the time, gopher frog was listed. And so we had a massive amount of frog kills on the road. So we actually, instead of just making a culvert, we had a 400-foot bridge because, they're relatively small and they need to, get towards the pond, and, we can't funnel them into a pipe. And then we had if you've ever driven, I'm sure you have, the bridge over the Ocklawaha River, big high
One of
level
my
bridge.
favorites, the
Yeah.
old Barge Canal Bridge. Is that what you're talking about? It goes about 150
we're going to replace that bridge. And the new bridge is actually going to be lower because the barge canal never happened. And so the new bridge is actually
we should do a whole show about that.
Yeah. That's actually a really interesting story. I mean, kind of
maybe that'll be.
So the new bridge is actually going to be in the canopy, and one of the things that was an issue, and it's still not really unresolved, but there's still a lot of discussion about it, is the Ocklawaha River is actually a flyway for neotropical migrant birds. And so one of the things that we're still trying to do, because we're actually in the design and permitting portion for that project, it's if we move the bridge deck from essentially above the canopy to in the canopy, and now you have moving cars, how do you prevent or increase bird strikes? Because the bridge has been there for so long, a lot of the migration is learned behavior. So they've learned to, fly basically through the trees in that area. And we looked at a lot of the stuff that was like actually done on the coast, like on the coast where you have pelicans and things like that, you can put a visual barrier up. But you can't do that because you're already in the canopy. So do you put a net up, and then, well, what happens if you catch something? Something gets caught in the net and all that. So that's been something we've still struggled with, actually. But I think the most interesting thing, and something I consider to be a huge win that came out of this, is when we were doing the design and the permitting for the easternmost sections. So the easternmost over next to Ormond Beach, which connects the wildlife crossings out there. We have 4 of them. Connect Tiger Bay State Forest to an existing Rainier Hutton conservation area, which then connects to Lake George, which connects over to Ocala National Forest. This was the first project in Florida and the second in the country that I'm aware of to receive federal mitigation credit for wetland impacts using wildlife crossings. And this was really kind of a pivotal moment for us because it recognized within the confines of the federal permitting that wildlife crossings have value that you can quantify. And you can quantify them in terms of dollars. And so what we were able to do when we got that included in the permit is, first of all, I ensured that they would be built because it's included in the permit. So now DOT has to build everything. But not only that, is I was able to go to Tallahassee and say, you were going to widen this road anyway. We were going to do all this stuff anyway. We just took $2.5 million off the cost, and you have a project that from an ecological perspective is better than it was before.
That's the key. Yeah.
So,
that's what I loved about your talks is that you can do this and we can do it in a cost effective manner and have such a positive impact on future.
Yeah, it's been phenomenal. And we took this to ICOET, which is the International Conference on Ecology and Transportation, in 2013. And this was still when it was conceptual. We took it to 2019 and presented after we had the permits issued. And now I'll be speaking next month at the ICOET with, now here's where we're taking it even further. So we've turned this into, we've just published a paper in a journal with how we did all this. And then I have 2 policy papers now that I've done for DOT. One is about applying mitigation credit for wildlife crossings. And really, we do that to ensure that they get included. And the second is specific to panthers, because panthers down south have what they call panther habitat units, which is a sort of a unit to determine what your impacts are and how you offset potential impacts to panthers. And the argument that we made is that you should get credit for a crossing that'll help panthers, and I think that credit should be applied to the roadway and shouldn't be necessarily applied to some static piece of land, that is 50 miles away. So we spent a lot of time doing. I don't know if you've familiar with the idea of gap analysis, where we want to connect larger parcels using. So I want to buy the gaps. So if I can find some parcels that are between like Fakahatchee Strand and Panther National Wildlife Refuge, what I want to do is I want to purchase those because I'm going to get a better bang for the buck. So when I make a recommendation to DOT on like where you want to go and do, these conservation projects, let's connect these larger parcels and then the wildlife crossings along the roadway become part of that. Because a wildlife crossing doesn't matter if there's nothing to connect. And I think that's what a lot of people lose sight of.
Did you have any key lessons that you took away from the design and implementation of these crossing structures?
So, it's funny. I have lost a lot more fights than I've won. As a matter of fact, I lose all the time because I'm the guy that very often is raising the cost of the project because, I want to get lizards from one side of the road to the other.
So you're that guy. Every time you show up, they say,
the thing is what I've noticed though, in the last probably 10 years or so, there has definitely been a paradigm shift in the attitude towards this, at least within the DOT world. Our study at the time when we did State Road 40 was really kind of a one of and almost a novelty, and that let's see what these guys can kind of come up with. The way that it's gone now, and I'm fortunate enough to be the permitting consultant for FDOT District 5, which is located in DeLand and covers Ocala National Forest and goes up into Flagler County and really kind of north central Florida, but also DOT District 1, which is located in Bartow, but does all of Southwest Florida, all the way down into Naples, so they get all the panther issues. And so I've had an opportunity because we're kind of in-house there to be able to speak to the folks that are making the decisions when those decisions need to be made and say, hey, have we considered habitat connectivity here? And so a lot of the work that we've done for DOT lately has been to write really these policy papers on here is how we can do these things smartly and in a way that is defensible. The last thing that we want, and I don't I don't want to poo-poo on development because I get all that. But, if I put a panther crossing in down near Immokalee, that's going to connect, the Florida Panther National Wildlife Refuge, and I want to apply credit for that and demonstrate that. What I don't want to happen is for some local developer that's going to come in and clear 1,000 acres to have them put a culvert under a driveway and say, oh, I did the same thing. So we have to do it in a way that's smart and is very deliberate and is very defensible. But I mean, I lose a lot. I get told no a lot.
I was curious, how do you deal with that? With those, I don't know if I would even call them failures, but how does that impact your day to day? Is that something that weighs really heavily on you?
Well, I mean, sometimes we go to the bar. Sometimes I just, you have to understand that you can't take it personally. And if you have conveyed the best argument that you can make for doing something like this, and the answer is still no, sometimes you just have to be at peace with it.
Yeah.
For me personally, though, usually where I leave it is, okay, well, I lost today, but this is not the last time you're going to hear from me on this. So, the next time this comes up, and we have a conversation about, a new roadway widening or, or something like that, you're going to hear me say, okay, where are the cats at? Where are the bears at?
Yeah.
I can tell you though, really what gets the most folks' attention, and this is not meant to, it's not meant as a divisive comment or anything, because this is their job. But the reality is so much of these things are cost based. Our wildlife crossings on State Road 40 added about $26 million to the job in construction costs. Now, that is a real number, at least at my house. And so I think about $26 million of taxpayer money is going to be applied, at least in theory, to a recommendation that we made. And so that sits pretty heavy with me. And so we want to make sure that we're as airtight as we possibly can get. The other thing that, is interesting, and it's true of a lot of professions, is, there's a lot of egos that can get in the way.
Sure.
There's a lot of, me first, my experience, and Jason from 15 years ago would be dealing with this differently. I'd be like, no, I did this thing first, and you got to do it my way, and all this stuff, and I want my name on it. As I've done this longer, one of the things that really is important to me, and I think it's taking these failures that I had because I couldn't get out of my own way early on in my career. The best thing that I can do is I can do stuff like go to the Wildlife Society conference and show these kids that are going to be doing this years after I'm retired and say, you guys need to do this. Like, you guys need to get excited about this. And so when I do my talks, it's as much of a, I try to do a little bit of a pep rally with it. Like, this is important.
Yeah.
And, so like, when you gave me the opportunity to do this, I was like, all right, man, this is great. Like, let's talk crossings. Let's talk getting, bears across the road. It's important. And I take it very, very seriously.
Well, definitely there's a lot of great work that you've been doing. And I would imagine, is there any number in your mind of estimates for the amount of wildlife that you all have been able to save over the last decade or so? Is there any number that comes in your mind?
So I can tell you on State Road on 40, some of we had reptile and amphibian roadkills, and some of them were in the 70, 80,000 range
yearly.
Yeah.
Wow.
And so, if I can do, some number less, get across the road, or get underneath the road. I've never really thought about it in terms of, what the number is. And it's mostly because math is my Achilles heel for sure. I'm not an engineer for a reason.
Mm-hmm.
So, but, I have, one of the projects that I was very fortunate enough to be involved with in District 1, just on State Road 80 east of LaBelle. It wasn't a dedicated crossing. It was actually a bridge replacement, and we installed a shelf because there was some panther telemetry in that area. And, Brent Central at District 1, I'm sorry?
By shelf, meaning?
So what we installed is where you have a bridge with riprap, just rock underneath it.
Yep.
We constructed what is essentially a sidewalk that's about 2 feet wide underneath the bridge. That was something, and covered it with dirt. That was not just rough rubble riprap rocks, so that a cat would walk on it. So the idea was, this is actually a fairly common retrofit we do or try to do on bridge replacements. If a massive crossing with fencing and all this is not really in the cards, if we can do a shelf, then when we left it, it's better than it was before. And in this case, on State Road 80 in LaBelle, there were several panthers that used it because we had a wildlife camera on it after it was constructed. And I can't say this with 100% certainty, but I'm certain enough to say it out loud, that the first panther in recent history to have babies north of the Caloosahatchee River crossed in that area and swam across the river in that area, because we had game camera pictures of what was clearly a female panther, and they documented the babies on the north side. Now, I can't say definitively, but I mean, we called that a huge win.
And that's critically important because of the range expansion of the panther.
Yeah.
Has never been documented in recent times past beyond the north of the Caloosahatchee River, as part of the Panther Recovery Plan, which is this big, long, detailed plan that's in place. So that's one of the goals of that plan, is to have panthers expand their range over time.
Yeah, the recovery plan actually calls for, I believe it's three separate populations in Florida. I think it is 3. Of at least 270 individuals. I mean, don't quote me on that. I haven't read that in a minute, but it's something like that.
At it too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that, what we can do is get people. I don't think people realize the amount of effort that the Florida DOT is doing to do this stuff. They pay us to tell them where to put stuff, and if it's going to work or not, and we have to be right because we're accountable to the taxpayers. But this is not your dad's just build roads and pave the world mentality, especially in South Florida. It's something that a lot of effort gets put into, and I don't think a lot of people realize it.
Definitely.
But it's important, and that's why I try to get in front of all those kids, like at the Wildlife Society conference, and say, hey, look, I mean, somebody needs to come do this. So you're going to see in my talks, you see a lot of pictures and a lot of me doing, let's go out and save the world.
So if anybody wants to find out more about you and some of the talks that you're giving, is there a way that they can do that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, Cully, you have my contact information. If you Google myself, I'm on LinkedIn. So it's Jason Houck, Houck. I'm on LinkedIn there. You can also, look me up at my company, which is Inwood Consulting Engineers. And that's www.inwoodinc. So INWOODINC.com. And if anybody knows Cully has my contact info too. You can, I guess reach out to him. But the more people that get involved and the more people that are interested, the better we're all going to be, because I think we make better decisions together. I'm just one guy, and we need to do this as a group.
And if anybody wants to find out more about the Florida chapter of the Wildlife Society, they can visit fltws.org. Check out we have a spring meeting and a fall technical session that is sort of a training opportunity for folks to get involved. So we usually meet twice a year, and then they have a business meeting as well. It's a nonprofit organization. We have a lot of scientists and managers and people who are passionate about. You can just be passionate about the outdoors. You don't have to be a professional to be part of the organization. So I want to wrap this conversation up, because you've given us a lot of great information and some great stories here. In your opinion, what is the most important future issue that we have with Florida's landscapes, and how do you think that we should go about tackling that?
In my opinion, well, that's a very complex question, but I really think that development and really fragmentation of intact, large-scale habitats that we have remaining is probably the biggest threat. The Florida Wildlife Corridor Act is really fantastic legislation. And it's, I think it's a little late to the game when you look at, some of the stuff that's done out west, but, at the same time, it's better than nothing, and it's here now. So I think what's important is we tend to be fairly reactionary to problems and less proactive. So if we do a better job, and I think we're going in this direction of planning corridors, green spaces, and things like that, and making those decisions deliberately and including those things, which is to say we're not going to build anything in this area, is important. They're not making more panther habitat in South Florida. And I think that the panther is a good example of what could potentially happen to the black bear in Central Florida and even in the Panhandle up in Apalachicola. So like wildlife crossings are great. And it's something that I've, had the benefit of being able to work on, but they don't work if we don't have the habitat to connect. So I think that the most important future issue, really, at least in my opinion, is we need to be proactive about maintaining landscape level corridors for wildlife, green spaces. And I got to go have a place to go hiking, man. Like, I got to get out there too. And I want to go see it. I just took my son backpacking. We did a section of the Florida Trail through Ocala National Forest over spring break. And it was, it was one of those things to me where, like, I got a chance to go out and walk in the woods with him, and I wasn't working. We just, it was me and my son on a trip, and it took me back to what I really got into it for. And it's, it's very centering. And Cully, I really appreciate you having me, man. I have really enjoyed this.
Definitely. Well, we certainly have had a great time, and thank you for your time and all of your great stories. This has been a lot of fun. We look forward to catching up with you again one day soon. Thanks again, and appreciate you taking us another step beyond the fire.
Thanks.
Enjoying the show so far? Feel free to check out my Instagram page at A Step Beyond the Fire for updates and bi-weekly episodes that are being posted on there. I'm posting some photographs when I can. I've also got a website, astepbeyondthefire.com. Now, I've posted a few stories on there. There's a contact page there. Feel free to reach out to me if you've got any stories or any types of subjects that you want me to cover in the future. I'm also looking for new individuals to have on this show. If you've got stories of conservation that you'd love to share, I'm all ears. Reach out to me there. I also would appreciate some feedback. If you can give some feedback on Apple Podcasts or maybe Spotify, check them out. Or you can send me an email message through the website. Hope to hear from you soon.